Sean, been talking about it all week, haven't we? Well, we've been speculating about it for a couple of weeks, in fact. But now we finally know what the government is proposing when it comes to welfare reforms. It's going to be much harder to claim health top-up that's part of the universal credit system for some people. And then there's PIPs as well, personal independence payments. The Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Liz Kendall, outlined the changes to both in the House of Commons yesterday.
We will legislate for a change in PIP, so people will need to score a minimum of 4 points in at least one activity to qualify for the daily living element of PIP from November 2026. This will not affect the mobility component of PIP and only relates to the daily living element. And alongside this, we will launch a review of the PIP assessment.
The changes in the round, according to the government, could save around £5 billion per year. A separate estimate, though, by the Resolution Foundation, the think tank, puts this at around 1 million people losing access to £5,000 per year by 2030. Well, to round all of this up, Lee Healey is joining us this morning. Lee's a welfare expert, 30 years experience in the welfare rights and advice sector. Lee, morning. Thanks for being with us on Wake Up to Money.
Good morning.
We've skimmed through a little bit of the top there. Why don't you start by just rounding us out with everything that you think people need to know, may have missed?
Yeah, sweeping changes announced by the government yesterday. Obviously, first of all, I guess the real big headline, work capability assessment, is going to be scrapped from 2028. And instead, the universal credit health element is going to be linked to personal independence payment instead. And that's a really, really big change. And on personal independence payment, obviously the government wants to really, really tighten the eligibility criteria. And they're going to do that by amending the scoring system, which is kind of what disabled and sick people need to go through when they claim personal independence payment. There's more, though. They're going to sort of take a fresh look at the national insurance contribution-based system by combining job seekers allowance and ESA, which is linked to national insurance, as sort of like a new unemployment insurance benefit. And I think there's just a sort of general move towards claimants needing to engage more. The government are talking about £1 billion worth of personalised support to try and help people get back into work. But there's some more worrying aspects as well. Things like youth benefit changes. The government wants to delay the universal credit health element until age 22 for most young people. And there's a possible increase in transition from child disability living allowance to personal independence payment, which would be currently, like you'd go through that change at 16, but the government wants to change that to 18. And then lastly, I guess this is kind of, there's some hope in there, is that they're talking about a new premium for the most severely disabled. So, I guess like the government, it looks like they're going to create another tier within things like universal credit.
Before we get into the details, Lee, just even hearing you list it all out, for a lot of people, and often fairly evidently, these are some of the most vulnerable people in society, there is an awful lot to get your head round.
Oh, there really is. And obviously, look, we know the government want to save money. They want to try and take £5 billion out of the system. But what we've got to remember is that, health is an issue for people, disabled people who rely on personal independence payment to survive, who obviously claim universal credit because of health conditions. They could be affected here, and it could potentially take a lot of money, from their pocket. And we already know that disability and health is a massive driver of poverty. And we've got millions of people who experience poverty in the United Kingdom. So there's a lot of fear, a lot of worry, a lot of anxiety.
Right, let's come to the work assessment element of all of this then. This was Dr. Fari Ahmed speaking to Sean, a GP, a little bit earlier on in the week.
Previously, employers had occupational health services, so if their employees were ill, they had a supportive way of helping them get past it, get better, get them back to work. Now, lots of places don't have those, don't have access to those anymore, and then it's back to the GP.
Right, so you talked about some of those changes, Lee. What are they then?
Yeah, so I mean, at the moment, if you kind of claim universal credit with a limited capability for work, so it's not even that you can't work. You know, the governments have always encouraged people to be able to work, but the government have kind of gone through this assessment process where they kind of it was a different one from the personal independence payment assessment with another scoring system, and you had to go through that, and you was assessed to decide whether you had a limited capability for work or not. The government just they're going to completely scrap that concept, and it really is a big change for the system, I think, really, because instead, I guess they're going to sort of use this personal independence payment assessment. I suppose they're trying not to double up on the amount of assessments that people need to go through. But it's difficult because it was always, I mean, listen, I've spent many years talking about the work capability assessment and its difficulties and its problems. But the trouble is if you did eventually get through the assessment process, you would potentially get some extra money within, your universal credit, and that would make a huge difference.
Anthony, looking from the outside, what did you make kind of in the whole of the changes, I suppose? What did you make of the debate?
I think it puts, like you said, a lot of vulnerable people at risk, because these are people who need the money because they can't work, and now you're taking that money away and they still probably can't find work, so they're just going to be put further into a more difficult position. So I think, if you're taking away £5 billion, as you said, from benefits, there needs to be like equal support in helping these people reintegrate, find jobs.
And Lee mentioned that £1 billion, in theory, that the government kind of outlined without tons of detail on it. But when they were out doing the media rounds yesterday morning before this vote, they were kind of really stressing that element and how beneficial it was for people to be in work. As an employer, what sorts of things would £1 billion of support be needed to do to try and help, I guess, you be able to hire more people who perhaps have got more complicated kind of needs than others?
Yeah, it would have to be things around like training, and maybe, because obviously the output that I get might not be the same as someone that may not have a disability. So for me as a company to have like an equal output, like there needs to be either maybe a subsidy for an early stage company like myself. Is like, okay, like for employing these people, there's like extra subsidy for you, or on the national insurance side, like doesn't make sense that we have to pay more if the benefit is getting reduced. That doesn't make sense for me, because then I'm just going to work out like how much less do I pay my employee to reduce the cost to my company.
Lee, does that sort of thing make sense to you? Heard Craig Beaumont from the Federation of Small Businesses on the BBC yesterday making this point that actually a smaller company is probably a good place for a lot of people to start because of the nature of it, not as kind of overwhelming and gigantic kind of organisation, that actually we've got more of those kind of small and medium companies all over the country rather than sort of having to commute to a big city or anything like that. From what Anthony's saying and what you've kind of heard so far, what would kind of make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth remembering that a lot of disabled people already work. Personal independence payment itself, it isn't even linked to, to working. It's more to do with the daily living needs and the mobility needs that you have. And honestly, on my 30 years, I speak to people every day, disabled people or people with health issues that do work. But you're absolutely right that sometimes people need a little bit of extra support, and that includes employers and disabled people and people with health issues working together. There's flexibility needs, and also there are schemes like Access to Work, which again the government are going to look at, because it is possible for disabled people to be able to get grants to be able to get perhaps the equipment or the support that they need in relation to actually being able to work.
Louise, it is always important on these kind of mornings when we've got stories like this that have got so much detail themselves to do the kind of economic backdrop again, because that's kind of what's driving all of this.
Yeah, and certainly, the UK overall is actually, I know, as someone mentioned earlier, a relative bright spark within the global economy because of its insulation from some of the tariffs. Yet, we're yet to see perhaps what those impacts might be. But overall, the growth numbers for the UK have been better than feared. So although there's still a lot of cautiousness, there's not a lot of confidence in terms of consumers, we're still kind of ticking along, I would say.
Yeah, and just in terms of the ramp up then to the spring statement, I mean, just £5 billion to you, just as someone sort of who's following the kind of broad scope of the economy and the decisions that we might have there. Just to you, Louise, did it stand out to you as, okay, that's shifting perhaps the difficult decisions that might be made there in terms of tax and spending? Did it seem to you as a sort of stabilising number? Just contextualise it for listeners.
I would say it's probably not big enough to move the dial too much, I would say. As you say, maybe most of that money ends up in kind of small businesses, and most of the kind of larger names are those kind of more multinational type businesses that we're looking at. And those are the ones that historically, do tend to do better in a lot of these types of environment because they do have the scale. And so they're probably the ones that are better placed. And so this amount of money doesn't necessarily make too much of a difference for them.
And is that a frustration there, Lee, that this might not do the job it's intended, which is to help shore up what are pretty rickety national public finances and cause disruption that you've kind of outlined?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's the worry and anxiety from even within the Labour Party itself and some of the MPs yesterday, who this is a difficult change because at the end of the day, it will affect people who are often on low incomes, who are vulnerable to life's ups and downs and are already sort of having quite tough lives through experiencing disabilities and health issues, So, I mean, for us, I guess, like in the advice sector, the job never changes. Whatever the system looks like, we will guide and support people through whatever it looks like. But of course, when you're talking about taking 5 billion out of the system, when you're talking about millions being affected, and you're talking about poverty already being an issue for people with disabilities and health, those anxieties and worries are there and they're valid.
I'm sure there's a lot of people listening this morning as well, Lee, who are looking for a bit of that support and help. Is there a place that they can go? Is there sort of a one-stop shop online or anywhere that they can look for that?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a really strong advice sector in the United Kingdom. There's a lot of people that really care about these issues. Local welfare benefits advice teams funded by local authorities. You've got amazing charities like Citizens Advice. You have the usual benefit calculators, but there's a whole sector. Sometimes you have to sort of do a bit of digging to find a benefits expert that's been doing it for a long time. But there is always help out there, and I'd always recommend anyone, if you're not sure what you're entitled to, or you're worried about the potential changes coming forward, seek advice and get some support on this.
Lee, thanks so much for your time this morning. Lee Healey there, welfare expert, more than 3 decades experience in the welfare rights and advice sector there. Anthony, the difficulty with all this is that it's one of those where there isn't actually necessarily a right answer here, is there, or necessarily a wrong one. Personal experience in my own family, you sort of lurch between what would help and not help some of the time, isn't it? And that's a very difficult thing to make policy around actually as well, when sometimes these needs are so complex. What can be right one day can be wrong the next day.
No, exactly. Especially when it's involving like vulnerable people and you're trying to quantify a saving with like a pound sign on it. Yeah. That's when it becomes very tricky. It's like, what is the price to pay on the social side of things? And I think that's where it gets a bit more tricky, because maybe policymakers are looking at it like a balance sheet. It's like, okay, we save £5 billion, but then like, how do you quantify that impact on like those million people across the UK?
And then you put that other people's frustrations. We got a text in from Tony in Edinburgh as well saying, this needs changing, needs looking at, because there are people claiming who should be working, and that puts real people who really need this help in distress as well. So not an area I'd want to be making terribly much policy in, I don't think. Louise, can we